All right, let's dive into one of the biggest questions out there when it comes to the Bible. When Genesis talks about creating the world in 7 days, are we talking about a literal week, or is this some kind of literary framework? Let's dig in and see what the text itself has to say.
Yeah, so that's the big debate, right? Is this a play-by-play of an actual week, or is it a beautiful metaphor for something way, way longer? The cool thing is, the text itself seems to leave a trail of breadcrumbs for us to follow.
So, our investigation kicks off with this really curious phrase that gets repeated over and over again. You can almost think of it like a timestamp, marking off the days. You see this exact phrase, and there was evening and there was morning, at the end of each of the first 6 days. Now, you might be thinking, wait a minute, evening before morning? That feels totally backward to us, right? But that little detail, that's actually our first big clue. And this is where we kind of have to reset our own clocks. I mean, for us, a day starts at midnight. It's a man-made system. But the biblical text sets up a totally different rhythm from the get-go. A day doesn't start at midnight. It doesn't even start with a sunrise. It starts at sunset.
And this is so, so crucial. When Genesis talks about a day, it's defining it for us as a full 24-hour cycle that kicks off with the evening. You know, like how the Sabbath is observed from Friday sunset to Saturday sunset. This isn't just some cultural thing. The text is literally hardwiring this model of time right into the story of creation. Okay, but that brings up a pretty good question. I mean, if you just hear evening and morning, that sounds like, what, 12 hours? Half a day? So how in the world does that phrase add up to a full 24 hours?
Well, this is where we have to put on our ancient Hebrew thinking caps. See, evening wasn't just about twilight. It was basically shorthand for the whole period of darkness. And morning was shorthand for the entire period of light. So when the text says evening and morning, it's a way of saying the dark part and the light part. Put them together, and bingo, you've got one complete day-night cycle.
All right, so that phrasing is clue number one. But the case gets even more interesting when we zoom in on the actual Hebrew word being used for day. That word is yom. Now, to be fair, yom is a flexible word. It can mean just the daylight hours. It can mean a literal 24-hour day. And yeah, it can even mean a really long, vague period of time, like when we say back in the day. So context is absolutely everything here. And that's the thing. The context in Genesis 1 is super specific. The author doesn't just throw the word yom out there. They lock it down in three very specific ways, every single time. First, it gets a number, day 1. Day 2. Second, it's bookended by that evening and morning phrase. And third, this whole pattern is repeated 6 times in a row. It's a formula.
And here's the linguistic kicker. Scholars point out that whenever you find this specific combo elsewhere in the Bible, a number plus the word yom plus evening and morning, it always means a regular 24-hour day. No exceptions. So the text itself seems to be building its own case, pointing really consistently toward a literal day. But look, the evidence isn't just about grammar. The argument really hits its peak in a totally different part of the Bible. There's this one passage that basically serves as the theological anchor for this entire discussion. This is where it all comes together. It's the moment the creation story gets directly tied to our lives, to human law. And suddenly, how long the days were isn't just a history question. It's a huge theological one. And here it is, straight from the Ten Commandments. God himself ties the human week directly to what he did during creation. The whole reason for our 6 days of work, 1 day of rest cycle? Because that's exactly what God did. He worked for 6 days and rested on the 7th. I mean, the logic here is pretty hard to miss, right? The command isn't just inspired by creation, it's set up as a direct one-to-one parallel. Our week is supposed to be a literal copy of God's week. And this poses a really tough question for the symbolic view. Because if God's days were actually, say, millions of years long, then what happens to the command for us to work 6 literal days and rest for 1 literal day? The whole logical connection just kind of falls apart. Okay, but what about the biggest counterargument? I mean, let's be real, Genesis 1 is beautifully written, it's poetic, it's structured, so doesn't that just scream symbolism, not literal history? And that's totally fair. The text is an absolute masterpiece of literature. You've got repetition, these elegant parallel structures, a very formal rhythm to it. Nobody's arguing about its artistic quality. The real question is, what did all that artistry mean to the person who first read it?
And here's the thing we have to remember. In the ancient world, using a sophisticated structure and style wasn't a signal that something wasn't true. Often, it was the exact opposite. It was a way to emphasize the importance and the reality of a historical event. You wrote about important history with high art.
And what's really fascinating is that when you look at the nitty-gritty of the Hebrew grammar, Genesis 1 just doesn't follow the rules of Hebrew poetry, like what you see in the Psalms. Poetry is all about parallel lines. Genesis 1, on the other hand, uses this chain of verbs that basically says, and then this happened, and then this happened. That's a classic sign of narrative prose. It reads like a story, just a very majestic one. So, when you pull all these threads together, the argument for reading these as literal days starts to look pretty strong. You've got narrative grammar, not poetry. You have very specific time markers. The Sabbath command is built on that literal parallel. And maybe most importantly, there's just no signal in the text itself to tell an ancient reader, hey, by the way, when I say day, I actually mean millions of years. And all of this really leaves us with a final, really important thought. This whole debate, it's not just about science versus religion. It's about how we read. How do we make sure we're hearing what the original author was trying to say, instead of just, plastering our own modern questions and assumptions all over their ancient words? Now that is the challenge for anyone who picks up a text this old.